Hello everyone, I am Professor Paul Carrier of Western Michigan University Cooley Law School, and I'd like to provide some information today that should prove helpful as you work through the materials for Class 8 of our sales class. The good news is we are now finished with Article 3, dealing with negotiable instruments and how they work, as well as Article 4, which deals with the customer and banking relationship, keeping in mind that checks are a form of draft that are also covered by Article 3. And as we move away, we go back to Article 2, and we do that for several reasons. First, you have not probably covered enough of Article 2 in your Contracts 1 and Contracts 2 courses to have a very solid understanding. And yet, Contracts 2 is a highly testable bar subject. Secondly, there are a few concepts that we cover in the sales class where there is not time to so cover in Contracts 1 and Contracts 2. And so we will augment what you know about Article 2, again, because it is so highly testable and, in fact, very practical as a commercial lawyer. Okay? What does Article 2 do? As you're dealing with the sale of goods, which are movables at the time of contracting, Article 2 provides certain truisms, certain general rules, certain guidance to create more flexibility in the relationship. And it's difficult to provide a clear explanation in short order, but I'm going to try anyway. Often, parties, whether they've dealt with each other before or not, can agree and can form a contractual intent, so the bargain is struck, although certain parts of it have not been discussed or have been discussed but not finalized. Nevertheless, the intent is that the bargain is formed and the parties intend that those small details that were not yet finalized will be taken care of as the related phase. That includes some shipping, some insurance, and these things can be taken care of over time. And if you have a very formalistic approach, anything different, anything missing, anything for which there's disagreement, as the parties are forming at the moment of formation of contract, would explode the relationship and we would not have a bargain formed. And we know as a reality that that just doesn't happen. Most parties out there are intending to enter into a contract and will do so with the full intent, even though not every I is dotted, not every T is crossed. The problem arises later when, for example, and one party is looking for any reason to get out of the contract, and it will use anything, including, well, we didn't talk about whether he was going to send it on Monday morning or Monday night, and that is a void. It is an absence of something really important in the contract. And our heart is broken if it's sent in the morning because we need to have it sent in tonight. And therefore we didn't have the intent and boo-hoo, we have no contract and we're going to buy it from the Chinese at half the price. That is just ridiculous. Okay, so you see that the UCC is moving away from a legal formalism and really trying to focus on the intent of the parties, which is often 70 or 80% agreed, with 20% to be taken care of over time without the explosion of the contractual relationship. Okay? Now, let me provide a few examples quickly, and we will discuss them again in class. One of these, you realize that there's a statute of frauds, and it's in 2-201 of Article 2, and it provides that contracts for the sale of goods in excess of $500 must be in writing. What is that writing? Well, you know the terms from common law. It has to have the parties, it has to state what's being sold or what's being done, it has to be signed by the party being charged, yada, yada, yada. The UCC, in its subsection 2 of Article 2-201, actually provides a little more flexibility as between merchants. If you're dealing with two merchants, often who deal with each other over the phone, a short note on a stickum, right, might be enough to memorialize the contract and indicate that it's been formed. In fact, the exact moment of formation of a contract no longer needs to be determined with pinpoint accuracy. There's some flexibility at when the exact moment of mutually contractual intent has been formed. There's some flexibility in when that moment is determined. And so if this merchant's memo that has the basic information and some kind of a signature is sufficient. Ed, pursuant to our conversation last week, we'll send you the 1,000 widgets at the price we usually send, subject to our ordinary standards and conditions, which you've been looking over and we've been working with for the last 30 years. Bill. That would be enough to memorialize that there is a formed intent by both parties such that a contract has in fact been formed. We will discuss in further detail Section 2-202, which deals with the parole evidence rule and interpretation. Mind you that the UCC respects the parole evidence rule. If there is a contract that is in fact fully integrated, then you are not supposed to use that Article 2-202 sub A, I believe it's A, allows, even if you can't use something to add to the contract, you can use course of performance, course of dealing, or usage of trade to explain things that are actually within the contract, that are already there, that may need some flesh out, that may need some interpretation. So that really would be an interpretation issue. Also, with regard to parole evidence, the UCC somewhat freely allows the input of additional information from different sources other than the contract, so long as they are consistent additional terms. If they are not consistent, then they do not go in. But if they are consistent and there's a merger clause, then they can still come in because the merger clause and its prohibition on anything else was probably never intended to cover these consistent additional terms, and so they come in. If it's dead clear, however, nothing we've said, nothing we've written is part of this contract, only what was signed today in New York, right? That would be a very, very strict merger clause. That is certainly acceptable for UCC Article 2 purposes. Often it's never quite that clear, and so there's some flexibility in how things conflicting additional terms. And even if they can't come in as new terms, what things can be used to explain terms that are in fact in the contract if they are not fully fleshed out. Article 2-204 also provides flexibility with certain formalities. An acceptance only has to be in a manner that reasonably shows agreement or sufficient to show agreement. It doesn't have to be necessarily a big writing, the signature on the contract mailed by the offeror. If there's something that manifests the agreement and the offeror does not require something special by way of agreement, then something sufficient under the circumstances should work quite well. The exact timing of contract formation is not necessary. If we know there's a contract formed, whether it's formed on Monday or Wednesday is immaterial. Okay? If there is if there are terms that are indefinite or not included, that is not fatal to contract formation. The UCC appreciates the use of gap fillers, primarily which you'll find in sections 2-305 through 2-311, plus the duty to act in good faith and with commercial reasonableness. We will talk about gap fillers in another course. Okay? You should have covered this in your Contracts 1 course as an option contract, but we will go over again, at least in short detail, the 2-205 firm offer, which creates an option that does not require separate consideration. Keeping in mind, there's a contract, for example, for the sale of widgets. There is a separate contract for allowing the offeree 1 week to decide before the offeror finds another buyer. In the old days at common law, each one of those had to have their separate considerations. Under the UCC in 2-205, now if a merchant puts in writing that he or she will leave open the option, in other words, not have the power to exercise the right to terminate for a certain period of time. If it's in writing and signed, it's binding for the time stated or a reasonable time not to exceed 3 months. 2-206 covers some flexibility in how the acceptance may arrive to the offeror. And so, for example, if the offer expects prompt shipment, then prompt promise to ship or prompt shipment, either of those, would be acceptable under the circumstances. And we get to as well the last major thing that we cover for Class 8, which is the Article 2-207 Battle of the Forms. What this does is it tries to avoid the mirror image rule, because it realizes, the people who wrote this realize, that parties often have certain inconsistencies that are small. They have certain blanks or empty spaces that are not filled out in the contractual intent on one side or the other. And parties often try to send different forms back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And so you still have to pick one that is an offer and then look at the other that is an acceptance. But where there are some additional terms that are different from the offer in the acceptance, there is a systematic way to address those such that they do not necessarily act as rejection/counteroffers because they are so different. And so we'll go over that again in the sales class. You should have covered it in your Contracts 1 class, but it is so important, and until you've really worked with it 2 or 3 times, so hard to integrate that it really makes sense to go over one more time in the sales course. Keeping in mind there is a focus on additional terms and what happens to them as between sometimes non-merchants and merchants, or both merchants on if there is a merchant on both sides of the equation. And there's the knockout rule, or there are different terms where there are 2 that are actually conflicting. Additional means it's not here, but it is here. What do we do? Different terms means it says X here, but Y here. What do they do? Okay? Very, very briefly, I'd like to provide some information on the primary focus of the cases, which should help you as you are briefing them before class. In the Columbia Nitrogen Corp case, we are dealing with 2-202 sub A, parole evidence, and what may be used by way of parole evidence. And if the contract is fully integrated, the ability to interpret using course of dealing, course of performance, and usage of trade. In the Diamond Fruit Growers case, the main focus is a 2-207 sub 1 Battle of the Forms mirror image rule, I should say, which in fact constitutes a rejection counteroffer, and therefore at that moment, because of that, the parties did not have a formed intent. However, the parties did continue to perform thereafter, which then leads us to the invocation of subsection 3, which deals with what we do, how we construct a contract, as a court, for example, where the parties do not have a specific agreement, and yet they've begun to perform, such that it has to be created out of what we have. Okay, so that this creation of a contract implied by conduct. When we get to Bayway Refining Company, we have a 2-207 subsection 2B material alteration question. And as well, when you're reading that, focus not only on the material alteration aspect of subsection 2 to the Battle of Forms provision, but take a look at the burden of proof, which I believe is mentioned relatively well there. It's covered. And also the standard of what constitutes a material alteration. And you'll be looking at surprise and or hardship. For Northrop Corporation, that deals with not additional terms, but different terms. Where there's one here, another one there. What happens? There are 3 approaches out in the United States in different jurisdictions, and we see a preference for the majority rule called the knockout rule. If you want to verify that, take a look at a note at the very end of that case. It's after that case, but a note explains it relatively well. And then finally, the Klochek case, where we're dealing with, again, Battle of the Forms, Article 2-207 sub 2. But this deals with the first sentence therein, where at least one of the parties is a non-merchant. And therefore, you should contrast the Bayway Refining Company case, which deals with 2 merchants, and the Klochek Gateway case, which deals with 1 merchant and 1 non-merchant. Okay, I'll see you in class.